What's up, you guys? Welcome to today's video. As you can tell by the title, we're going to be talking about Dahmer the Monster, which just came out on Netflix. This is actually going to be the first video in my Jeffrey Dahmer series. I'm going to, in this video, break down every single episode of The Monster on Netflix. I'm going to give you my opinions, the psychological profile on Dahmer, things the show got wrong, his body language, and just how fascinating, in the worst possible way, that Dahmer was. Before I start this video and before I start the Dahmer series, I think it's really important to note that yes, I'm going to be talking about this serial killer who had many mental health issues, but it does not escape my mind that the victims are the ones that suffer the most, and the families of those victims are still suffering today. Even though Dahmer was arrested in 1991, those families have had to live with that forever. And as much as I think that a lot of the family members, from what I read, want to just move on and they want people to stop talking about this, that's not realistic when we're talking about a serial killer who was so deranged and sick and just, I don't have words, evil, just pure evil. So even though it is unrealistic for the family members to want everyone to stop talking about it, my heart does go out to them because I can't imagine how horrific this must be for every few years a big company like Netflix or what have you come out with another show on Dahmer. And the reason why they do it is because there's a lot that can be learned about this entire situation. This is not just about Jeffrey Dahmer. This is about his victims. This is about how our system failed to protect those victims. This is about how racism and homophobia played a huge role in letting Dahmer go on for a decade committing these heinous crimes. So there's a lot that we can learn from this case as a whole. And that is what I hope to shed light on in this video and the videos that I have to come. I'm also not going to be saying the names of the victims. I have a lot of notes here of all 17 of the victims and their interests and their family and where they're from. But as I started to do more research and I started to see how the victims' family members are really upset about the new Netflix series, I'm going to not say their names just out of respect. So please don't think that I'm trying to be disrespectful. There's also a lot of lawsuits pending and I'm not trying to be sued. So right now I don't really feel comfortable to share the victims' names, and hopefully that changes in later videos. But without further ado, let's kick this thing off. Okay, so Jeffrey Dahmer was born May 25th of 1960, and the show really does a good job at kind of giving us his background, but his psychological profile has a lot of mental health illnesses. And I want to start with that first as I kind of break down each episode, just so that that's on everyone's mind. But his psychological diagnoses are borderline personality disorder, schizotypal personality disorder. I'm not exactly sure if I'm saying that right. In fact, I know that I'm not. That is a very specific personality disorder. And with that personality disorder, you're gonna have a lot of social anxiety, a lot of paranoia. What makes this different is that someone with this personality disorder, they're gonna have a really hard time creating lasting bonds and relationships with people. And that kind of goes back to the paranoia, where they think that other people have just bad intentions or negative thoughts surrounding who that person is. So that is what makes, social situations awkward. There's also probably going to be a lot of psychosis with this personality disorder. They're also going to have a lot of unconventional belief systems and ideologies that are outside of the norm. He was also diagnosed with psychotic disorder. So he was diagnosed borderline, schizotypical, I'm probably not saying that right, personality disorder and psychotic disorder. There was also necrophilia and cannibalism. Oh my gosh, so this is a very disturbing individual, to say the very least. Episode 1, we see Dahmer in this creepy little apartment at his sink, cleaning blood off from his hands with a kitchen knife, drinking a Bud Light. Like, this is normal, like just making a steak of human. What? So immediately we're like, okay, we're just gonna go with that. And episode 1, they show a lot of little things throughout that episode that you really need to be paying attention to. And I would say that throughout the entire series, you have to pay attention because they go back and forth in time a lot. So in episode 1, they do this very quick glance of the coffee table and there's a satanic Bible. If I walk into someone's house, okay, and there is a satanic Bible on the coffee table, I'm sorry, I'm gonna go. I've got to go. That's my cue. Okay, that it's time for me to just head on out, okay? I'm not trying to be sacrificed in some creepy apartment. So the first episode like lays it all out there. I mean, we really see just how horrifying this entire scene was, because we see Jeffrey in the kitchen and he's chopping up some people. We hear about the neighbor, Glenda. She's calling the cops. She's like, hey, there's a horrifying smell coming from this apartment. We see Jeffrey go to the club and bring back the person that survived and ran out of the building and got him caught. We see all of it. We see his dad in the police station, you know, hearing these things for the first time, hearing what really happened. What I thought was really interesting in episode 1 was how shocked his dad seemed, right? And can I just say that I love that that is the same dad that played the dad in Step Brothers? Like, I really felt like his dad genuinely was a good person that really cared about his son and wanted his son to fit in and do okay, right? So like, I love that it's the dad from Step Brothers because he's a great actor. He's a great actor. Could you imagine that though for a second? You're sitting in the police station. You know your kid's kind of weird. You know that he'd struggled a lot in life, and we'll get into that, but you're sitting in the police station and the cops say to you, this is a murder investigation. And in episode 1, the dad says,
when you said it was a murder investigation, I thought that someone had tried to kill Jeffrey.
Sir, your son is a literal monster. But as a father, as a parent, I can't imagine how difficult that must have been, because once you hear about all of the horrifying things that your child has done, everything that was odd or off or what you saw in his, you know, life, it makes sense now, right? In like the most disturbing way. So we see the survivor run out of the building and it is just a very tense situation. I can't believe that the cops brought him back to Dahmer's apartment. Like, I'm sorry, I'm not going. You can put me in the back of the cop car before you can take me back up to that apartment. Like, no, absolutely not. But that really happened. The cops bring back this survivor, okay? They're like, hey, do you have a handcuff key? The fuck? Don't y'all have a handcuff key? Absolutely not. No, you want me to go where? Could you imagine that? I would be like, y'all are out of your minds. Like, I would go, take me to jail. Just take me to jail. I would rather go to jail than go back inside of that creepy ass apartment. And the cops are like, I'll just go get the handcuff key. What? I mean, I'm glad they did, because that's how they found all of these victims' body parts. But I'm sorry, officers of the law, get me out of these handcuffs. Isn't that your job? Don't you do this all the time? You want me to go where with you? Like, my mind could not comprehend that they brought a second person, and I'll get into it, back to Dahmer's apartment. Like, so in that tense moment in episode 1, where Dahmer is caught, the victim is in the hallway because he's like, I'm not going in that apartment, which is really fair. I'm surprised they got him up those fucking stairs. Like, I'm not the one. I know I've said it a million times, but like, no. The victim is outside in the hallway, and these cops, they were able to go in. Jeffrey just kind of let them into the apartment, and the cops see these Polaroids, and they are detailed Polaroids, and Jeffrey took pictures of his victims, sometimes even during the actual murder, which, what? You would think that he would not keep things like Polaroids in his apartment because he could get caught. But this person did not just keep Polaroids of his victims, he kept his victims. Like, he kept their body parts. He sometimes ate their body parts. He would freeze some of them, cook some of them, mummify body parts. I mean, he was a very, very disturbed person, and he would do this as if it was like a normal thing. And that kind of goes back to all of his personality disorders and just how mentally ill he was. Now let me tell you what they found in Dahmer's apartment, because it is the most horrific. Like, my brain can't compute these details to you. They found a human head in the refrigerator. They found male genitalia in the freezer. They found a full skeleton, okay? A whole ass skeleton, the whole thing, They found 5 heads in the bedroom. A 57-gallon vat of acid with 3 torsos. They also found hearts in the freezer. And the last victim had said, I ran out of the apartment because this maniac was laying on my chest and said,
I just want to listen to your heart because I'm going to eat it.
remember what I said about the Satanic Bible? You see one of those, get out of there immediately. Immediately no. When that victim and that survivor heard that, he was like, oh, hell no. No. And he hit Jeffrey and got out of the apartment, which thank God, right? Like I can't even. So that is where episode 1 starts. We start from the jump, from, oh my God, there is a whole ass serial killer in this apartment building. Episode 2 gives us another scene from the police station with Jeffrey. He waives his right to a lawyer. He's like, no, I don't want a lawyer. I want to tell you everything I did, which, wow. That to me is very compelling. Like he knew that he was caught, but he didn't want to lie about it or hide it anymore. He just wanted to let the world know what was really going on in his mind without going into too much detail about his psychological profile and the things that I believe about Dahmer. This was not him showing remorse and wanting empathy or compassion for his crimes. This was him finally being like, you know what? This is who I am. This is what I did. I think that he just didn't want to hide it anymore. There's also a very common thread when it comes to serial killers, and that is that they want to see that reaction. So he doesn't feel remorse or empathy, and we'll get into a lot of that later, but he was telling them these things that he had done that were so horrific with a very stone cold, matter-of-fact attitude, if you will, and he just, I believe, wanted to see people's reaction to that.
I desensitized myself to it.
Which is very obvious in later interviews with him, like the real interviews. Back to the show does a really good job of taking us back and forth from different time frames. So in episode 2, starts with him in the police station, and then we're in 1966 because who the hell was Dahmer when he was a kid? What is wrong with this person? What would happen so wrong in his life? I think that he was born this way. But as a kid, he was into dead things or like roadkill. So him and his dad, who was like a scientist, they would go get roadkill and like dissect it. So that's kind of where his fascination was. And I don't think that's his dad's fault. I think his dad was like, oh, my son is finally showing interest in something and let's bond over like roadkill. And I get it. Like some parents go hunting with their kids. You know, I'm a New Yorker that never went hunting, so I don't get it, but I get it. So that's not that outside of the scope, right? Like that's not that strange. So a lot of the beginning part of episode 2, you kind of just feel bad for him sometimes where you're like, oh, he was really lonely. He had no friends. And that might be a very big complaint when it comes to the family members of the victims watching this, is like, you can kind of in some moments feel a little bit kind of bad for him because there is this core thing where he just wanted to be with someone and he wanted to not be judged for being gay, for having all of these, you know, desires that his family didn't understand or people in his circle didn't understand. He was very lonely. So again, there's a lot of skipping around. So we go from 1966, you know, he's struggling, he's a young adult, like things are a little bit rough. We skip to 1991. You really have to pay attention with this series. And there is a dead body in his bed. And he's like holding hands with this victim. And okay, we see Dahmer go to a liquor store and these very young boys were too young to buy alcohol, so they were denied. And Jeffrey bought this young 14-year-old kid alcohol. And he gets this boy to go home with him. Same kind of thing. He drugs the young boy. The boy falls asleep. And Jeffrey goes back to the store for more alcohol to get him what he liked, because I guess the alcohol that he got originally the kid didn't like, which can't confirm. Not sure on that detail. What is crazy about this victim is that he was so young, but his brother was actually SA'd by Jeffrey. And at this point in 1991, when he meets this 14-year-old boy in episode 2, Jeffrey is a convicted sex offender. Well, when this boy is passed out in Jeffrey's apartment, he goes back to the store to get more alcohol, and Glenda Cleveland, she is like, something is wrong. She's steadily calling the cops, right? Well, this boy stumbles out of Jeffrey's apartment and he's like naked in the street. So Glenda sees this kid and she's like, oh my gosh, let me help this kid who is freezing, naked in the street, very disoriented, very obviously intoxicated or drugged, and something is really wrong, right? So she's like, let me call the cops. She calls the cops. After calling them who knows how many times at that point, the cops come to the Oxford apartments. They see this very young kid, and Dahmer was able to convince the cops that this 14-year-old boy was his boyfriend who was 19, and he was just drunk. He's just an alcoholic, he's just super drunk, and he's like, oh, we have pictures together, like, you can come upstairs, he lives with me. So they returned this boy to Jeffrey's apartment, and an hour later, Jeffrey killed that boy who was 14 years old. Now you really have to take a step back and look at it for what it is. Jeffrey Dahmer was convincing and manipulative and white as snow in a very impoverished neighborhood, and there was also a lot of homophobia during that time. So these cops were like, oh, it's just two boyfriends, they're fine, and they just let it go. They let it go, and they even made some really nasty remarks in real life on the radio, which we can talk about in another episode, but they returned that young boy to Dahmer's apartment. Now, can you imagine what that must have been like for Glenda? Now, I believe that Glenda Cleveland in the show was a mix between Glenda Cleveland and Pamela Bass. Glenda actually lived in the apartment building next door, but she kept calling the cops, and now she finally has this baby that you have to return home. This kid is very young and he is drugged and something is wrong, and he was covered in like marks and stuff too. Like something was obviously very wrong, and these cops were like, everything's fine, they're boyfriends, go inside. How frustrating must that have been for Glenda? And she tried and she was completely ignored so many times. Now in episode 3, we really get a very good idea of how Jeffrey was raised. His mom, who was pregnant with Jeffrey in 1959, gave birth in 1960, she was on like 26 different pills a day. She was really struggling with her mental health. She would be diagnosed later with postpartum psychosis. It's like postpartum depression, but very severe. She was depressed most of the time, just in bed, just a very absent mother because she had a lot of mental health struggles. Then we fast forward to 1977, you get an idea of Jeffrey. He's fishing with his dad, and he's a teenager at that point. And you could just see like something's wrong. Like he doesn't want to talk about girls. He wants to gut these fish and he's like really happy doing it. There's also like a very clear undertone where he's like excited about that. When Jeffrey was 17, his mom and his dad were like in this crazy divorce battle, and his mom ended up leaving Jeffrey at his home for, I think it was a few months, like 3 months. Well, the dad didn't know. The dad was with his soon-to-be new wife, Sherry, which we see in episode 3, and we just see kind of how difficult that was. Jeffrey's home all the time, by himself for months on end, drinking every day. In 1978, Jeffrey's first victim, who was a hitchhiker. Well, he brings this hitchhiker, who was a very handsome young man, home, and in the show, they're working out, and he wants to leave, and Jeffrey gets mad and hits him, and he dies. Dahmer would go on to say later that he did not mean to kill this first man. It just kind of happened in the heat of things. And once this person was dead, he was able to chop this person's body up. And this was kind of what he had been training for his whole life, with all of these experiments and the roadkill and this obsession with dead things, in this instance, a human being. Dahmer does what he does. He cuts up this person's body, and he has his experiments where he's trying to dry out bones so he can shatter bones, which he eventually figured out how to do. And he basically took this person's body and scattered it everywhere. In the lawn, he buried parts of it. And this is what is really horrifying, is that that first murder should have never happened, right? But that should have been, for all intents and purposes, the only murder victim of Dahmer, because he was pulled over the night of this murder with this person's body in pieces in trash bags in the back of this car. And do you know what happened? Was he arrested? Was that discovered? Of course not, because then why would we wouldn't be here today, right? We wouldn't be having this moment together, learning about Dahmer. The cops were like, hey, you're drunk, what's happening? You're driving all around. They let him go. Okay? In the show, you see that, where the cops are like, hey, what are these bags? And Dahmer's like, oh, they're yard clippings at 2 a.m. That makes sense. Grass. It's just grass in garbage bags. And I'm drunk. The cops were like, okay, just drive home safe, okay? Just make sure you go straight home, okay? Drunk person, drunk underage person that has a dead body in the back of the seat. What? What? Crazy. And that just reiterates once again that this is not just about Dahmer. This is about systematic failures within our police system. He should have been stopped right then and there. The amount of times that Dahmer should have been caught is crazy to me. And yet he kept getting away with it for a very long time. And that is what is really sad about this entire story, is that there should not have been 17 victims. I mean, there shouldn't have been one. But after this first one, he should have been arrested, and he wasn't. It is very frustrating. The hitchhiker who was the first victim of Dahmer, he was killed in 1978, and his body was not found until 1991 when Dahmer was arrested. And that takes us to episode 4, where we can see the cops are digging up bones and body parts of that first victim. And it is just so mind-blowing to me that no one throughout that whole time found any kind of evidence that would kind of alert law enforcement to, hey, maybe someone died here. Dahmer would say in interviews that the reason why he scattered his first victim all around the house, like all around the yard, is so that he could keep this person around him all of the time. How creepy is that? And we'd see that with later murders, right? He just wanted these people in any way that he could possibly keep them around him all the time, even when they're decomposing, and the human body decomposes pretty quickly. That doesn't matter. He just wants them there in any shape or form that he could possibly get them there. Episode 4 takes us back in time, like almost every episode does. Like, you really have to pay attention. But we see that after he killed his first victim, his dad finally came home and he was like, hey, why are you here by yourself? Where's your mom? What's been going on? And his dad kind of freaked out and was upset that his mom, justifiably so, left him there. So his dad's like, you know what? You're gonna go to college. You're gonna go to college. Well, that's not really a good plan, because I don't know if his dad was paying attention to Jeffrey before this whole incident, but he wasn't that good at school. And the same would be true after college. He had like a 0 GPA, like 0.45 GPA. I mean, his blood alcohol levels were probably higher than his GPA. Well, he dropped out of college pretty quickly. His classmates would go on to say like how weird he was and like how uncomfortable he was. He would drink all the time. Well, after college, his dad was like, you're going in the fucking army. Like, I don't know what to do with you anymore. Get your shit together, because all signs are leading to not a good direction. You need to get your life together. You're going in the freaking army. So Jeffrey packs his bags and he goes to the army, and his dad has like a glimmer of hope, right? Like, this is gonna be the thing that gets my son out of whatever teenage angst. You know, I wouldn't say that the signs are headed towards cannibalism just yet, but the signs aren't good, right? So maybe his dad's like, teenage angst, my son is struggling, the army is gonna fix it. I think the army made it worse, and here's why. He becomes a medic, so now he has like a lot of knowledge that he wouldn't previously have had if it was not for the army. It also gives him a pass with a lot of people, and we'll get into that later. It gives him some clout, right? And it gives his resume some stock later in life. But he's a medic, and he's learning about things like drugs, certain drugs that could like drug people. Well, he was eventually kicked out of the army, but they gave him an honorable discharge. And the reason he was kicked out of the army was because he was a really bad alcoholic. But a couple of his bunkmates or army buddies or whatever would come out later and say that Jeffrey actually sexually assaulted them. So maybe the army kind of knew that this was like a bad person. There was something more going on besides alcohol, because I don't know, something was definitely fishy there, and the army was like, we're done. They just kind of wanted him out. So they kicked him out of the army, but they gave him an honorable discharge. So his dad is pissed. Like, his dad is pressed when he gets out of the army. He doesn't want to go straight home. He kind of hangs out in Florida for a little bit, but doesn't like it. Now he's back home and his dad's mad. But this episode really shows you just how much being homosexual was frowned upon, looked down on, and misunderstood. His dad and his grandmother, they came from a different time, and even in the 90s it wasn't as accepted as it is now, which is so sad. But his grandma was like, just meet you a nice girl, you just need to meet a nice girl, just go get a girl. Like, you know, like it's not clicking. I know I'm spending a lot of time on episode 4, but it tells us a lot of stuff. It tells us that his family didn't understand homosexuality or accept it. It was the devil, I guess. It also tells us how he became a registered sex offender. His grandma was like, oh, you should go to the fair, because she's thinking he's gonna meet a nice girl, right? And his grandma's like, there's a beer tent, go to the fair. He goes to the fair, gets drunk, and exposes himself, and also sexually assaults a young boy at the fair. Remember in episode 2 where the cops brought back that young boy? Yeah, it was his brother. So crazy. Now he's a registered sex offender. And even in this court proceeding, the judge was like, you seem like a nice boy. You should go to jail, but I'll give you work release. So like go to work and then go back to jail. I'm sorry, what? Yeah, so he's just getting passes left and right. In this episode, we also see Dahmer going to the gay bars and going to bathhouses, and I had to look that up. I didn't know what that was. Essentially, this is just a hotel-like, gym-like club, I guess, that has rooms where you can just go and like, you know, have sex with people and work out, and there's saunas, and it's like a club, I guess. I don't know. Unclear. So after he becomes a sex offender, he gets a job as a nurse, like drawing blood. How did he get that job? Oh, because his resume says Army medic. So this person was like, oh, you're overqualified. Yes, Army medic. Yay. America, you can totally work here. It's fine. In the show, we see Jeffrey steal blood and drink it in the bathroom and like really enjoy it. And you can see in that very dark and creepy episode that he is almost like aroused by this blood. That's not accurate. The show kind of embellished a little bit there. Dahmer would go on in later interviews to say that he just tried a vial of the blood on the rooftop of this place that he worked at, and he spit it out. The end of episode 4, he is going to the gay bars. We learn what bathhouses are, which I had no idea. Well, he's kicked out of the bathhouses because he's drugged 2 people now, and he didn't kill them, but they like overdosed, and then like the owners of the bathhouses, they had to be like, hey, you can't come back here because you fucking drug people. It's confusing because you're like, does he just want to have sex with people that are not moving, that are passed out? Or does he just really want to do both of those things, right? Like kill them and all that stuff. Crazy, crazy. It's a very confusing, very sick, very dark and demented human being that we're talking about. And it's difficult to understand all the aspects of who Dahmer really was, but he's kicked out of the bathhouses and he takes his second victim to a very nice hotel. He accidentally, in the show, drinks the wrong thing, which would make sense. And I think the show had to embellish a little bit here because Dahmer would tell in later interviews he doesn't remember killing this person, but Jeff wakes up, dude is dead. He goes home to his grandma's house, gets a big suitcase and puts this person in the suitcase and just wheels him out. Side note, Reese better not complain ever again about me taking too many things in a suitcase because it won't fit, okay? Like if a full man can fit, my clothes can fit. Sorry. Episode 5, he is at grandma's house. Now, he ended up killing 3 people at his grandmother's house, and this is another thing where he should have been caught. His grandma, I guess, couldn't get down the stairs to go to the basement, but there were horrible smells coming from the basement. And over time, I guess Jeff would stop being like, hey, I'll go to church with you, or let's talk about the nice girl that I'm gonna meet. He would go out and frequent the gay clubs and bring someone home, kill them in his grandma's house, and then like dismember them in the basement. So at a certain point, his grandma was like, hey, this smells really bad, what is going on? His grandma knew that something was wrong. Eventually, in the show, the grandmother calls Jeff's dad, like, yo, your kid is bizarre. There's crazy smells coming from the basement, can you please come over here? And because of the whole, I'm gonna chop up roadkill with my dad thing, his dad really thought that he was just doing experiments on animals, and he gets away with it. So he killed 3 of his victims at his grandmother's house, and in interviews, he would say, oh, I know that it was smelling really bad, so I figured out that as long as I triple bagged the garbage bags that had bodies in them, they wouldn't smell. So there is another survivor that the grandmother saved. Now, the show had to embellish a little bit here, and they also left some details out. Jeff brings home this guy from the gay bar. They're hanging out. The grandma knows that there is something wrong because she's seen a lot of shady shit, right? So she's like, no, something's wrong. She goes down there to confront Jeff, and he's like, grandma, he's passed out. And that grandma is not having it, and like, you gotta love her, right? She's like, okay, I'm going to sit here until he wakes up. I'm gonna sit here. And when he wakes up, you know, he can go home. Tell me she did not know that her grandson was killing people. You cannot convince me that she didn't know. But there's no love like a Mima, you know? Like a grandmother's bond with their grandchildren is very different, and like maybe she just really wanted to believe that there was good in there, but she knew. She was onto him. She saved that person's life. And this is kind of where the show had to embellish it a little bit because it's unclear just how involved she was with this victim, but she made sure that he got on a bus and went home. or so we see, right? That guy ended up in the hospital, sexually assaulted, drugged, and covered in abrasions. And that's something that the show left out. They didn't say that he was sexually assaulted or covered in cuts. They kind of just show him waking up there. And that guy was like, I'm gonna go to the cops. I know that it was this guy, this creepy dude over here. The cops go to Jeff and his grandma's house and they're like, hey, this kid was apparently drugged. And the grandma's like, well, my grandson didn't hurt him. I was here all night. And she kind of covered for him without realizing it. So the cops came, they talked to Jeffrey. They're like, yeah, everything seems straight here. Totally fine. They were just partying and having a good time. The grandma says it's cool, everything's Gucci, and they leave. And they don't do any more investigating, which had to have been a very frustrating thing for that survivor. Like, no, I know something's wrong. People go out of the bar with him and they don't come back. And like, I was obviously hurt. This is the person that hurt me. And the cops are like, yeah, but you're good. Like, he could have killed me. Yeah, but he didn't though. Like, that's how the cops are acting. Like, what? Here we have another instance where the cops believed Jeffrey over everyone else. So I just want to reiterate, this is not just the Dahmer story. This is not just about Jeffrey Dahmer. This is about his victims. This is about how law enforcement failed them time and time and time again and kept a serial killer on the street for a decade because they just didn't believe what was going on and they just turned a blind eye, ignored it, and laughed it off. So he totally gets away with that. Now, episode 6 is probably one of the most heartwarming episodes of the series. You see them spend a lot of time on one of his victims who was an aspiring model. He was part of the deaf community. You can see in episode 6 just how, how loving this person was, how kind he was, how kind and incredible his family was. I mean, you really get a sense of who that victim was in episode 6 and just what a great person they were. I think they spent so much time on this particular victim in episode 6 because Jeffrey actually knew this person for a year before he killed him. A year. Now you would think that that would be the last victim, right? Because now we finally have a connection. All the other people, there's no like social connection there. There's not a lot to go on, it's random people. So in terms of investigating a murder, if there's no connection to the victim, it's very difficult to have suspects, right? But here we have a connection. Jeffrey and this man knew each other for quite some time. Jeff was very infatuated with this victim and he kept this victim's body in his apartment for 3 days before dismembering him. What is very interesting about this is that he took pictures of this entire process from start to finish. And that might be another reason why episode 6 spends so much time on this victim in particular, because it was different than the others. He knew the person for a long time. He photographed the entire process. He kept this victim decomposing for days before he dismembered him. That's also the first time that we see in the series that he was eating parts of these people. Episode 7 I really call the aftermath. So again, it takes us back to Jeffrey getting caught and the cops coming in and all of these, scenes with law enforcement. We see Glenda watching the news and you can see at first like the real aftermath of just how, sickening this was for everyone in this building. We see Jesse Jackson come on scene. You really start to feel just how frustrating this was for Glenda, who again, I think is a mix between Glenda Cleveland and Pamela Bass. Pamela Bass lived in the apartment in real life across the hall from Jeffrey, and then Glenda Cleveland actually lived in the apartment building next door, next to the Oxford building. There's a scene in episode 7 where Glenda complains to the manager of the apartment building. The manager comes up. He's like, yo, Jeff, what's going on? It's the smell, you're evicted. Then there's a very tense scene where Jeff and Glenda are actually in Glenda's apartment. Oh my God. You could tell that being around Jeff was a very uncomfortable thing for Glenda, but she did not want to appear as though she was afraid of him. And whew, how could you not? How could you not? I have gone to prison and there's only a couple of times where I have sat in a room with someone or sat next to someone and the hair on the back of my neck stands up and you're immediately uncomfortable. That is the energy that this person would give off, is the energy Jeff would give off. So there's a very tense scene where Glenda's like, I know something's up, I'm not afraid of you. And Jeff's like, I made you a sandwich. It's a fucking person, right? And Glenda's like, okay, I'm not eating that. Get out of my apartment. In real life, Jeff was actually not served with an eviction notice and Glenda was not given a sandwich. The sandwich comes from Pamela Bass was given a sandwich from Jeffrey, and that's where that comes from, like in real life. But the cops just keep ignoring Glenda. Jeff's still in the building. Shit is crazy. Just making sandwiches out of humans. Like, what in the fuck? Now, episode 8 shows more of the dad in the police station, and he's, you know, talking to the investigators and talking to the cops, and it is just a very crazy conversation because it's like, hey, bro, so about your son, he like stays killing people. And after hearing all of these things, Jeff's dad stayed by his side, wanted to talk to attorneys, and just really wanted to get Jeff to say that he was mentally insane. Was Dahmer insane? Hell yes. Hell yes. But was he legally sane? Those are two very different things. Was he mentally competent enough to stand trial? Abso-freaking-lutely. So Jeff's like, I'm not crazy. I'm not insane. I'm not going to say that I'm insane. I know what I did was wrong. I'm going to tell them what they want to know. And his dad's like, no, bro, nah. Like, let's try to help you out of this situation. Like, still, talk about a ride or die father. Like, your son was eating people. And you're like, hey, son, listen, we're just going to try to say that you're insane so you can go to a mental hospital and get help. Like, you gotta give it to the dad, you know? Like, it really seemed like he cared. Oh, and this is the book, if you guys are interested. This is the book that Jeff's father wrote. Whew, I haven't read it, don't want to. I think this is enough for me, honestly, but he really seemed like he gave a shit, right? Like, he really seemed like he cared and he wanted to be there for his son. His son is like, absolutely not, Pops. I'm not crazy. I'm gonna tell everyone what I did. I am very grateful for that, for a psychological reason. So abnormal psychology is really interesting to me. And if it wasn't for his willingness to share all of these things, we wouldn't have found some of the victims. We wouldn't know about some of the victims. We wouldn't have the interviews that he has done that tell us in psychology, not that I don't have a PhD, tells people fascinated with the psychology and the human mind just how emotionless a serial killer to this magnitude can be. Now, I didn't mention a lot about Jeffrey's mom other than to say that she had a lot of mental health issues and postpartum psychosis. She kind of reappears and she writes Jeff a letter saying that she's very sorry that she failed him and she tried to take her own life, which is really sad. She was unsuccessful in taking her own life that day. Joyce Dahmer, Flint, who went by Rocky, passed away of cancer in 2000. She really struggled, and I think that is just heartbreaking. But in that episode, we see that she tries to unsuccessfully take her life. Do you remember how I said a couple of times already that the cops brought back a very young 14-year-old victim to Dahmer, who he killed an hour later? Yeah, those two cops, they were suspended because it, like, looked bad, you think? And in episode 8, we see that those cops are reinstated and put back on the force. What the show got wrong is that they were not given awards that year, but they were reinstated and became cops again. Yay. Oh, sorry, to back up a little bit, you see victim impact statements in court, and they are some of the most heartfelt, gut-wrenching statements you will ever see. And one of the victim family members actually tried to lunge at Jeffrey, and like, can you blame her? I kind of wish she got to him, if I'm being honest. But these victim impact statements were, I can't even imagine being in that position. What the show did really well is they, in my personal, very biased opinion, is they got the impact statements very on point. The sister of one of the family members who tried to lunge at Jeffrey, screaming at him and just was very aggressive, that was very spot on. It was very accurate to what really happened. Jeff's statement that he made in court was also pretty spot on to his actual statement that he made in real life. Episode 9 and 10 kind of go into detail of his prison experience, which I'm going to do a full video on, but you see that he is in prison and he is weird and he like is kind of in PC, but he's kind of not, and I don't think the show explained that very well. So he was in PC, but he had work detail and he could go to the chow hall and stuff in the regular prison, which is weird. Like, that's not PC. PC, from my experience, is you're not getting out, fam. Okay, like, you're in this box, you're in this cell by yourself, 23-1, and when you want to go to the rec yard, the library comes to you, but the rec yard, you have to be cuffed up. You want to go to the shower, you're cuffed up, you're by yourself. That's what I think should have happened, but that's not what happened. He was like in partial PC, part-time protective custody. I don't know. He's getting fan mail, which you would not think that the most disturbing serial killer in American history, a cannibal that was into necrophilia, you would not think that this person would get fan mail but he did. Episode 9 also shares a lot of the family struggle. Like, they have to live with this now. You know, he's in prison. He received like 900 years in prison, and right, he's not getting out. But the family members are kind of just left with this horrifying reality. They live in this town. Everyone knows all of the family members. This is something they have to come to terms with and find peace in somehow. I mean, it is very bad. The family members start to sue the Dahmer family for just anything, any kind of monetary compensation, which of course would never bring back their loved ones. But there was a lot of just mental anguish from everyone that encountered this in some way. Even people that weren't directly affected. This was a small town. Like, everyone knows this was going on, and it's something that it's happening in your town. It's still gonna affect you. So this just affected everyone, right? But the victim's family would go on to sue Lionel Dahmer because he wrote a book, so they wanted the money that came from the book. I'm not exactly sure now that I'm thinking about it. I'm not sure if the family members tried to sue the Wisconsin Police Department, but if they didn't, they should have, because they failed them so many times. And just to add another little detail here that you might not know is that Glenda Cleveland didn't just call the local law enforcement. She got so frustrated that she ended up calling the FBI, and the FBI is like, yeah, that's not our jurisdiction. And then 7 weeks later, after her calling the FBI, he was arrested. Episode 9 also shares Jeffrey being stabbed in the neck in church. It was satisfying to see him like get shanked real quick. You know what I'm saying? Prison shanks don't go as deep as you would think. So just a quick like bam with like this little whatever it was. You're not gonna die typically from a very small shank, and I guess it missed the artery in the show is what they said, but he survived that. That takes us to episode 10, the final episode, and it does not start out with Dahmer. No. It starts out with John Wayne Gacy, and if you want me to do a whole episode on John Wayne Gacy, I totally can. He was also a very bizarre serial killer that was the clown serial killer. This person was hiding bodies under his porch, I believe. Very evil, very disturbed serial killer who was executed on the day that Jeffrey Dahmer was baptized. And it gets weirder, okay? I don't know, like, in what world all of these things could have happened on the same day. There was also an eclipse, okay? You know, like the sun, can't look right at it. Yeah. There was an eclipse, bro. So John Wayne Gacy is executed on the same day that Jeffrey Dahmer is baptized, and there's also a freaking eclipse. Like, is that like Mercury's in retrograde? I don't really understand it. So like, what in the actual hell, literally, is going on? Creepy. Finally, after 10 episodes, we see Dahmer get what he deserved. Karma comes full circle. An inmate by the name of Christopher Scavier? I can't say it. He kills Jeffrey in the weight room by beating the crap out of him with weights. In the show, this particular inmate, Chris, he asks the librarian like for specific books on Jeff. He's like, hey, why is Jeff hated by everyone? Why is he so weird? And the librarian's like, we can't give you that because you have mental health issues. Let me just tell you right now, if someone comes in of that magnitude that has done all of these horrible, horrific, heinous things, there is not a prison in America that every single inmate does not know what's going on. It doesn't matter if you're on library restriction, I guess, which is what they're trying to say that Chris was on. It doesn't matter. He would have known. He would have had every single detail because every single inmate knew exactly who he was. They knew exactly what he had done, all of the victims. I mean, this was plastered all over the news. Every single inmate knew exactly who Jeffrey Dahmer was. And they knew who the victims were. It was even very possible that some of the victims' family members or friends could have even been at that facility, but that inmate would have known ahead of time who Dahmer was. Chris actually murdered 2 people that day, not just Dahmer, but someone with the last name of Anderson who was in for murdering his wife. Chris took both of those lives that day, and I believe he received a life sentence. What the show did not tell you, and what Dahmer has not told us, what remains a mystery, is when Dahmer was in the army, he was stationed in Germany, Okay, the show covers that. What they don't cover is that there are 5 unsolved mysteries in Germany, and this is the town name, the name of the town in Germany that he was in. There's 5 unsolved mysteries there that were committed between 1979 and 1981 when Dahmer was in Germany. And we don't have any closure on that. It is completely unsolved. Dahmer never admitted to any of these murders. He was never questioned about these murders, I don't think. And there's no connection, so we don't know. But there is potentially 5 more victims that we don't know about, which is hard because when you watch Dahmer's interviews, he seems very honest, and I'm gonna do a whole body language thing on it. But the crazy thing is, you would think he would have admitted to those murders, right? But he was drinking really heavily, and who knows? Maybe he doesn't remember, maybe he blacked out. Dahmer says in interviews that he had 9 years where he did not commit any more murders. His first victim, that was committed in 1978 or 1979, right? Well, 9 years went by before he killed someone else, victim number 2. So in every interview, he's like, there was never an opportunity to do that. There wasn't a physical chance for me to do that. I wanted to, but I couldn't. Or did he black out and kill these 5 men in Germany when he was stationed there and have no recollection of that? Who knows? And because Dahmer is dead and he was cremated, there was a battle over his brain. That was factual. But his whole body is cremated now. We will never really know if Dahmer committed those 5 crimes. So, wow, that was a journey. All in all, I think Netflix did an incredible job, and I think they really do take you from Dahmer's perspective. They show you a lot about the victims and what they went through, and then they show you how systematically racist and homophobic law enforcement was, and how he was able to get away with it. I mean, it does not just show Dahmer's story, and I hope that the victim's family can get peace, and I can only imagine how hard it must be to be part of that and have it seem to never go away, and have it seem like, oh, Dahmer's this like crazy notorious serial killer, but what about the victims? I hope that the family members of the victims know that everyone watching the Dahmer story is very aware of the victims. They will never be forgotten, and I hope they all rest in peace. I'm gonna end today's video here. As always, I love you guys. Stay safe, stay in recovery, whatever that looks like to you. Be on the lookout for video 2, where I'm going to be talking about fact versus fiction of everything that Netflix got right and wrong in Dahmer the Monster. And I'll see you guys in my next one.